You may be seated. You know, baptism is more than a big splash. Merriam-Webster Dictionary defines the word splash in 3 ways. One is a short plunge. Number 2 is an ostentatious display. 3, a dash of liquid upon or against something. Well, let's look at definitions 1 and 3. If one is a Baptist who performs baptism by immersion, well, then a short plunge might be an adequate view of the mode of baptism. If one is a Methodist, where a sprinkle of water on a baby's forehead, well, could be a method of baptism. Of course, sprinkling and immersion are modes and methods of baptism. You know, even the second definition could be somebody's definition of baptism. You know, a ostentatious display. When I was in seminary, professor of worship told us, the class, this story about a minister who got a call in the parsonage, and it was someone on the other line says, "Pastor, I would like to get our child done on Sunday." And the pastor responded back, "Is that done or well done?" Here, the definition of baptism can be one that is an ostentatious display. But we can learn some things from the reading that Kyle read from you, from Matthew, about Jesus' baptism and what baptism is. First of all, baptism is surrendering ourselves to God's loving call and purpose. Baptism is not an ostentatious display. Baptism is not a big splash. It's not a show. You see, I liked how you began the reading of your passage there, Kyle, talking about Jesus. Well, he didn't have to be baptized, but he chose to be baptized by John the Baptist because he wanted to identify. He was fully human, and he wanted to identify with others. Well, didn't John the Baptist said, you know, you should be baptizing me and not the other way around. But Jesus says, let it be as it is. And so Jesus was baptized. Not a showy thing, not something that's pretense. It was Jesus really setting himself in alignment with God's will and God's purpose. You know, God can see through the pretense. Really can. There's a lawyer, and he was a new lawyer. He was in his office, his first office, and the first day he was looking out of his window and he saw a person coming in. Didn't know what to do, so he decided he would look busy, so he picked up the phone and started talking, saying these words as the person came in. "Look, Harry, about that amalgamation deal, I think I'd better run down to the factory and handle that personally." "Yes, no, no, I don't think that $3 million will swing it. We better have Rogers from Seattle meet us here. Okay, I'll call you back later." So he looks up at the visitor and says, "Good morning, how can I help you?" And the prospective client says, "Well, no, you can't help me at all. I'm just here to hook up your printer." Jesus comes to John to be baptized, not for a showy display or to garner praise or adoration. He comes publicly, putting his life in God's hands. Baptism is surrendering to God's will and God's purpose. Secondly, baptism is a public act. It's one where one is baptized surrounded by their family, by their extended family, by their church family. It's something that we do publicly. It's not an isolated private experience. It's not a short plunge and then it's all over. You know, I have an iPhone. I probably use 1% of it. But you can do a lot with that iPhone. My major was sociology in college, and one of the things that we talk about is social movements. And it's been a while since I've been in that discipline and read things, but we're getting to the point where we're going to be studying people who have been brought up with this technology, with social media. And there's going to be a lot of questions that are going to be asked in that, don't you think? Now, I don't want to come off as a Luddite. I have a cell phone. But the questions are, does this social media, does it distance ourselves from actually getting together, from seeing each other eyeball to eyeball? One of the things that I read in the early of our beginning of our country is that people would get on trains, and so they could have conversations together. They didn't have cell phones. And that was one of the ways that strangers could meet strangers, talk to each other, eyeball to eyeball, person to person, face to face. You see, we need each other. Baptism is a public act. We do it in the midst of the fellowship. Somebody said, they asked the little boy, says, what's the definition of fellowship? He says, there are 3 fellows in a ship. Not a bad definition, really, when you think about it, because when you're out in the water and the water is rough and it's tossing you to and fro, you need somebody in the ship or in the rowboat to help you navigate in the midst of things. Jesus' baptism was public. We know about John. Scriptures tell us John the Baptist, he stayed in the wilderness, baptized people in the wilderness. But what did Jesus do? He was baptized, and his public ministry was in the towns, the villages, and through the city. He went to where people were living and struggling and dealing with life. Thirdly, baptism is about freely receiving God's grace and Spirit that sends you and I out into the messy business of ministry. Did you know that ministry is messy? Did you ever notice that? It is messy. And sometimes we look at Jesus, we sometimes want to make him a man of the year. But Jesus lived a life of struggle. And at Christmas time, we talk about Jesus in the manger, meek and mild. No crying does he make. And yet Jesus grows up. And when he is baptized, he begins his public baptism. He begins his public ministry. That means he is going to minister to the least and the last and the lost. He's going to tell those that are in power, he's going to tell them that, the first is last and the last is first. He's going to tell those that really were in a domination way of looking at life, you got to forgive your enemies. Jesus really said some harsh things. Has Jesus ever disturbed you? I'm comforted by his words. But there are passages in the Bible where when Jesus goes into a town, there are people that want to run him out. There are people who call him a troublemaker, stirring up the crowd. You see, when we are baptized, you and I, into a ministry that is messy. Again, I get back to Kyle. Kyle, you did a great job today. You know that? You really did. You were talking about, I was sitting there. I said, should I preach or let's let Kyle keep talking? You're really talking about the Bible, and you were talking about the Isaiah passages, the 4 suffering servant passages. You were talking about it was, 700 years before Christ came on the scene. What is the New Testament telling us when they use the Isaiah's words about the servant, Jesus? How does that relate to him? Well, let's read it again. Here is my servant who I uphold, my chosen, and whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him, and he will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not cry or lift up his voice or made it heard in the street. A bruised reed he will not break, a dimly burning wick he will not quench. He will faithfully bring forth justice. How is this to be, we might ask? I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind, to bring out the prisoners from the dungeon, from the prison those who sit in darkness. See, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. And before they spring forth, I tell you them. This view of servant is one who comes to serve people. This is a view of the Messiah, the leader who serves. The leader who serves. Baptism is not a big splash, but is the call upon our lives. A call upon our lives to be in the messy stuff of ministry. Dr. Ernest Campbell, who was a pastor at Riverside Church in New York City, he would often advise his congregation this way: energize the usual rather than schedule the unusual. Jesus went out in ministry and participated in the usual things of life, where people struggled, where people were looking for light and hope, and where justice was really for those who are at the top, the wealthy and the powerful. Baptism. It's more than a splash. Amen.